Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to discuss what appears to be a significant escalation in the enforcement of sanctions against Russian oil exports. Because whilst most of the headlines over the last few months have focused on Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, rising oil prices, and the wider impact on the global economy, another important story has been developing in the background. Western countries have quietly been stepping up their campaign against Russia's shadow fleet. And we're no longer talking about sanctions being announced from behind a desk in Brussels, London, or Washington. We're talking about helicopters, naval vessels, commandos boarding oil tankers, and ships being detained, investigated, and in some cases seized. And the reason this matters is because oil remains one of the most important sources of income for the Russian economy. The war in Ukraine is now well into its fifth year. Russia continues to spend enormous amounts of money on military operations, weapons production, recruitment bonuses, military salaries, and the support for its defence industries. And despite all the sanctions introduced since the start of 2022, Russia has still managed to generate hundreds of billions of dollars from energy exports. One of the main reasons for that has been the development of what's known as the shadow fleet. Today we're going to look at what the shadow fleet actually is, why Russia relies upon it, why Western countries are now targeting it more aggressively, and whether this growing campaign could start creating real problems for Moscow. But before we get into those details, can I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscriber button? It really does help me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. Now let's get into the details. The latest development happened literally overnight. The British government announced that UK forces had intercepted and boarded a Russian shadow fleet tanker in the English Channel. The vessel, called Smertos, had recently visited a Russian Baltic port and was travelling through one of the busiest shipping routes in the world. The operation reportedly involved Royal Marine Commandos, helicopters, Royal Naval vessels, surveillance aircraft, and officers from the National Crime Agency. This wasn't simply someone asking to see the paperwork. This was a major enforcement operation. And what makes this particularly interesting is that the British government didn't simply announce that it had happened, they released footage of it. As you're seeing on the screen now, you can actually see British forces boarding the tanker and taking control of the vessel. Now, governments don't normally release this sort of footage unless they want to send a message. And the message isn't just aimed at Russia, it's aimed at ship owners, ship operators, insurers, everybody involved in transporting Russian oil around the world. And the message is quite straightforward. The risks are now increasing. For years there's been a belief that sanctions could be worked around, that if you had the right ship, the right ownership structure, the right flag and the right route, you could continue operating with relatively little interference. What this footage demonstrates is that the authorities are becoming increasingly willing to take direct action. And the UK is not alone here. France has also released footage from several recent operations involving vessels linked to Russia's shadow fleet. Images of commandos descending from helicopters onto oil tankers are designed to attract attention. They're designed to make headlines, and they're also acting as a warning because every operator involved in this trade can now see exactly what they might be facing. And that's why we need to talk about the shadow fleet itself. When Western countries imposed sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine, one of the primary objectives was to reduce Russia's oil revenues. Restrictions were imposed on shipping services, insurance, and the G7 introduced a price cap. The intention was to limit the amount of money flowing back to Moscow without causing a global energy crisis. Russia's response was to create an alternative system. Over the last few years, hundreds of older tankers have been acquired through complex ownership arrangements involving shell companies, offshore registrations, and opaque financing structures. Many of these vessels operate under flags from countries with relatively limited oversight. Ownership can be pretty difficult to establish. Insurance arrangements are often unclear. Ships regularly change their names, flags, and operators. Collectively, these vessels became known as the Shadow Fleet, and they've become critically important to Russia. Today, a large proportion of Russia's seaborne oil exports move through this network of vessels. Without it, Russia will find itself in a situation where it will be much more difficult to sell crude oil around the world. In simple terms, the Shadow Fleet has become Russia's workaround. It became the mechanism that allowed oil to keep moving despite the sanctions. And that's precisely why Western governments have now started focusing on it. What we're seeing now appears to be a gradual escalation. Over the last year, a growing number of countries have begun physically challenging vessels suspected of participating in these operations. Estonia was one of the first countries to take direct action. The authorities boarded and detained the tanker called Kiwala in the Baltic Sea. At the time, many observers viewed it as a relatively isolated incident, but things quickly started to escalate. A month later, another vessel called the Jaguar became the centre of an international confrontation after Estonia tried to intercept it. Reports subsequently emerged that Russia scrambled military aircraft into the area. Suddenly, what had begun as a sanctions issue was starting to take on a military dimension. Germany then became involved. A tanker called Eventin suffered serious mechanical problems in the Baltic Sea while carrying Russian oil. German authorities eventually moved to seize both the vessel and its cargo. And that was a significant step because it demonstrated that governments were prepared not just to stop ships, but potentially confiscate valuable assets as well. France has perhaps been the most active country of all. Over the last few months, French forces have intercepted multiple vessels, including the Grinch, the Denia, and most recently the Tagore. In several cases, commandos boarded the ships, examined documentation, and escorted the vessels into port while investigations were carried out. President Macron has repeatedly argued that the Shadow Fleet is helping to finance Russia's war effort and that sanctions are meaningless unless they are actively enforced. And that's probably the key point here. Sanctions only work if you do enforce them. For years, there's been criticism that Russia was finding ways around the restrictions, alternative shipping arrangements, payment systems, buyers, routes, and of course the Shadow Fleet itself. What we're now witnessing is a coordinated attempt to close some of those loopholes. In March, another major operation took place involving Belgium and France. A tanker called Athera was intercepted in the North Sea and subjected to extensive investigation. Again, the focus was on documentation, ownership structures, and compliance with sanction regulations. And now we have Britain's operation against Smertos. When you look back and look at all of these incidents together, a pattern starts to emerge. This is no longer a series of isolated incidents, it's increasingly resembling a coordinated campaign involving multiple European and NATO countries. And that's where the economic consequences become particularly important, because every detention creates delays, every investigation adds costs, every interception introduces uncertainty, and every seizure increases the risk. If you're financing a vessel, insuring it, or operating it, or purchasing cargoes carried by that vessel, those risks matter. The more difficult and expensive it becomes to move Russian oil, the lower the profitability becomes. This doesn't necessarily stop exports overnight, but sanctions are often about creating friction, increasing the cost, reducing the efficiency, making businesses more complicated, and over time, those factors can have a meaningful impact. We've already seen Russian crude selling at discounts to international benchmark prices. We've seen transport costs going up, and we're seeing increasing complexity throughout the supply chain. And all of those factors ultimately reduce the amount of money flowing back into Russia. For an economy that remains heavily dependent on energy revenues, that's a major problem. Of course, Moscow isn't simply accepting all of this without responding. Russian officials have repeatedly condemned these actions. The Kremlin has described some of the interceptions as illegal and accused Western governments of interfering with lawful commercial activity. President Putin has warned that Russia has the right to defend its interests, and perhaps most fascinating development has been the increasing involvement of Russian naval assets. There have now been multiple reports of Russian warships escorting vessels associated with the Shadow Fleet. If we just think about that for a moment, Russia is now using military resources to help protect oil tankers. That tells you how important this issue has become to Russia. So what started out as a story about sanctions is gradually becoming a geopolitical confrontation at sea. On one side, you've got Western countries attempting to enforce sanctions. On the other, you've got Russia attempting to protect one of its most important sources of income. Because at the end of the day, this comes down to one thing: money. The Russian economy, the ability to fund military operations, and its ability to generate export revenues and continue working around Western sanctions. So does this mean that the Shadow Fleet is now going to get closed down? Well, that's probably a long time away. The fleet remains at large. There's a lot of them. Russian oil continues to be exported, and revenues are continuing to flow into Russia because buyers are continuing to buy Russian oil. But what appears to be changing is the level of risk. For several years, the Shadow Fleet was viewed as a clever workaround to the sanctions that could just be a permanent setup. But what we're seeing now is Western governments attempting to turn that workaround into a liability. Every operator involved in the network now has to answer a simple question: is the risk still worth it? Because if enough ship owners, insurers, financiers, and service providers decide that the risks have become too great, then the Shadow Fleet will become less effective. And if the Shadow Fleet becomes less effective, Russia's ability to bypass sanctions becomes much weaker. So while the world's attention remains fixed on Iran and the Middle East, it's important not to lose sight of what's happening elsewhere. The sanctions against Russia haven't disappeared. The enforcement effort hasn't faded away. In fact, based on the evidence of the last 12 months, it is now intensifying. The interception of the Smertos by the UK government wasn't just an isolated event. It was the latest chapter in what increasingly looks like a coordinated campaign against one of the most important pillars supporting Russia's economy. Russia built the Shadow Fleet because it believed it was a great way of getting around the Western sanctions. The problem now is that the Western countries appear to have stopped chasing the oil and started chasing the ships. And if that trend continues, it will become one of the most significant economic challenges facing Russia over the next few years. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. At the end of today's video, you'll find a link to Joe Blogs Russia, which is where I'm posting all of my Russian content and some extra stuff that isn't going onto my main channel. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe, watch some of the videos. I need your support to grow the channel. And I've also attached a link to Joe and Naz, which is very different to what we're talking about today. This is a bit more light-hearted, a bit more fun, a bit more entertaining. So if you want to see me in a completely different guise, then please check that out, subscribe, and watch some of those videos too. And in the meantime, here's something to put a smile on your face.